By 1935 and 1936, the Dust Bowl had squeezed the last remaining strength from thousands of farming families. Their cattle were gone, their crops were dead, their savings disappeared, and their children coughed blood from dust pneumonia. For many, the emotional breaking point arrived not through a single storm, but through the arrival of a simple rumor that spread like wildfire. Work existed in California. Newspapers and traveling merchants described orchards bursting with fruit, peaches, oranges, almonds, and fields overflowing with lettuce, grapes, and cotton. Recruiters sent advertisements across the plains promising high wages and steady work for anyone willing to pick fruit. The images felt like a fairy tale compared to the choking darkness that surrounded them. To farmers trapped in a dying land, California became a symbol of hope, a vision of clean air and full stomachs. The idea of leaving home was painful. Many families had lived on the same farms for generations. Grandparents were buried in local cemeteries. Houses had been built board by fathers and sons. Orchards planted decades earlier still stood beside porches, even if their branches were now bare. To abandon these places meant abandoning identity and history. Yet the storms kept coming, and banks kept foreclosing. Some farmers tried to hold on longer than their neighbors, convinced loyalty to land would be rewarded. But loyalty could not produce wheat. Loyalty could not feed children. And soon, one by one, families made the heartbreaking decision to leave. Preparing to migrate west was an act of desperate teamwork. People sold furniture, farm tools, heirlooms, saddles, and even books. Some sold plows to scrap dealers. Others traded livestock for gasoline. Cars and trucks that had been gathering rust in barns were hauled into daylight and repaired with scrap metal, rope, and determination. Families built makeshift roofs from plywood and tin so they could sleep inside their vehicles. The Dust Bowl taught America that art could be activism. Photographs traveled to Washington, shaping political debates about federal aid. Books influenced new laws. Magazine stories convinced urban Americans to support farm relief. In a time when the nation struggled to breathe physically, these artistic works helped it breathe emotionally, giving expression to grief, anger, defiance, and hope. No Dust Bowl narrative is complete without mentioning Woody Guthrie, the Oklahoma-born musician whose songs turned struggle into national poetry. Woody spent his youth drifting through Oklahoma towns, playing music for coins, and absorbing the culture of farm communities. When the storms ravaged the plains and migrants filled the roads heading west, Guthrie witnessed everything firsthand. He watched neighbors pack trucks with homemade furniture, saw women cry as they nailed boards across abandoned houses, and listened to men whisper about California wages they might never find. Guthrie traveled alongside migrants to California, hitchhiking, riding freight trains, and playing guitar in work camps. His music was shaped by these experiences, the hunger, the laughter, the determination, and the injustice. He wrote songs that turned migrant laborers into heroes rather than charity cases. His ballads described dust storms not as accidents of nature, but as consequences of environmental betrayal and political neglect. Songs like Dust Bowl Blues, Dust Pneumonia Blues, and I Ain't Got No Home carried the voices of thousands. Guthrie used humor, anger, and tenderness to express how it felt to lose land, dignity, and identity. He described children coughing dust, fathers begging for work, and families building tents beside irrigation ditches. His music broke silence. Migrants sang along to his songs around campfires, letting lyrics carry their grief. Importantly, Guthrie refused to romanticize suffering. His honesty separated him from traditional folk artists who sang about simplified country life. He wrote about corruption, police harassment, landlord exploitation, and wage theft. He wrote about California growers hiring desperate laborers and then paying starvation wages. Many radio stations refused to broadcast his music, fearing it was too political. But Guthrie kept singing because his goal was not popularity, it was truth. His influence stretched far beyond the 1930s. Guthrie inspired Bob Dylan, Bruce Springsteen, Johnny Cash, and countless musicians who later shaped American folk culture. His guitar carried a famous slogan, "This machine kills fascists." It symbolized the radical idea that art could challenge injustice. Guthrie believed that music could demand fairness, give the poor dignity, and help people feel less alone. For migrants living in tents and shacks, Guthrie's songs were medicine. Hearing their struggles sung aloud reminded them that their suffering mattered. It helped them feel human again. Guthrie also shaped public memory. Today, when Americans think of the Dust Bowl, they often recall the cultural voice he created. Dusty roads beneath wide skies, lonely guitars playing in darkness, families marching west with exhausted hopes. Through Guthrie, the Dust Bowl became part of American myth-making. Not a forgotten catastrophe, but a story of resilience embedded in the national imagination. While migrants and farmers fought to survive storms, journalists and radio broadcasters fought to make sure the rest of the country understood what was happening. Before the Dust Bowl, national news rarely covered rural hardship in depth. City newspapers focused on industrial labor, Wall Street crisis, and political conflicts. But as storms intensified and migration reached historic levels, the Dust Bowl became impossible to ignore. Newspapers sent reporters to Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico. Some came expecting exaggeration. They left stunned. Articles described school children fainting from dust inhalation, farmers blinded by storm grid, and families burying children whose lungs could no longer breathe. These reports forced urban Americans to confront rural suffering they had never imagined. Radio played an even more powerful role. Broadcast technology had recently expanded across the nation, and radio ownership soared during the 1930s. Every evening, American families gathered around wooden sets, listening to voices describing the latest dust storms, government programs, and migration statistics. Radio announcers used dramatic language, calling storms black walls and rolling nightfall. Through radio, the Dust Bowl entered living rooms in every state, turning regional suffering into national conversation. Some broadcasters traveled through the plains, interviewing real families. They recorded mothers describing hunger, children talking about dust masks, and old men remembering a time before tractors. Listeners could hear fear in voices, wind roaring in the background, and coughing from dust inhalation. Radio made suffering real enough to move people to action. Donations increased. Churches organized charity drives. Schools mailed clothes and books to Dust Bowl counties. Not everyone supported this coverage. Some California growers and Plains politicians accused reporters of exaggeration or damaging regional reputations. But despite criticism, the media continued pushing stories forward because the truth demanded attention. Journalism also influenced government decisions. Photos and reports reached the White House, shaping Roosevelt's relief efforts. When Congress debated funding for conservation, representatives held photographs above their heads showing buried houses and ruined farms. Emotional evidence replaced abstract debate. The Dust Bowl proved that storytelling is power. Without journalists and radio voices, the nation might never have understood the scale of devastation or cared enough to intervene. Media gave the voiceless a platform. It challenged stereotypes about migrants, revealing their intelligence, humor, faith, and perseverance. It changed how Americans viewed rural poverty, turning shame into shared responsibility. Thus, while wind and drought destroyed soil, journalism built bridges, connecting fields of dust to the hearts of people thousands of miles away. Children who lived through the Dust Bowl inhabited a world unlike anything childhood is expected to be. Across the Great Plains, childhood innocence collided with environmental terror, forcing young minds to age long before their time. Many children recalled that their earliest memories were not of toys or playgrounds, but of dust masks, coughing fits, hunger, and endless wind. They learned responsibility through hardship, feeding animals that barely survived, hauling water when wells failed, and helping parents seal windows before storms. Youth was shaped not by imagination, but by necessity. Dust Bowl children woke each morning to brown daylight filtering through house cracks, air thick with the smell of dirt. They helped sweep floors before breakfast and wiped dust from plates before placing food upon them. In some households, children learned to chew carefully to avoid sand grinding into their teeth. Their bedrooms were never clean. Their toys rarely stayed dust-free. Bed covers, even freshly washed ones, felt gritty against their skin. School life changed drastically. Many schools closed for weeks at a time because dust storms made travel deadly or because inside air became too dangerous to breathe. Some children wore damp masks across their faces while teachers struggled to speak over the howling wind that rattled windows. At recess, when recess existed, children often stood indoors staring at swirling dust outside, unable to play games or run through fields. Textbooks rarely remained dust-free, and writing became difficult because dirt covered desks and pages. Teachers improvised, using wet cloth to wipe desks during lessons. While reading, children brushed dust from book margins, their fingers stained brown from turning pages. Meanwhile, fear crept into education. Children asked teachers if the world was ending, why storms never stopped, and whether the sun would ever return. Health crises dominated childhood memory. Dust pneumonia endangered young lungs, and doctors lacked antibiotics to fight bacterial infections that followed. Children coughed through nights, slept upright to breathe, and missed school weeks at a time. Some died. Those who survived developed chronic breathing problems lasting decades. Doctors warned parents to move if they could, but most families lacked enough money to leave. Emotionally, children navigated trauma without vocabulary to describe it. They witnessed adults cry quietly at night, mothers scrubbing floors until exhaustion, and fathers staring at barren fields with empty expressions. They watched families load trucks with belongings to flee west. Some saw neighbors collapse from heat or dust suffocation. These sights shaped how they viewed adulthood, teaching them that stability was uncertain and that nature could betray human effort in an instant. Yet, Dust Bowl children also demonstrated remarkable resilience. They created games using scraps of wood, bottle caps, and imagination. Some built kites from flour sacks and flew them in rare calm weather. Others played baseball using dust as chalk lines and rocks as bases. Children turned adversity into invention, finding joy where logic suggested none existed. Parents tried to protect their innocence, reading bedtime stories, singing hymns, telling jokes, or promising that rain would come soon. But children were not blind. They knew danger hovered constantly, even inside walls. The Dust Bowl generation carried childhood memories filled with contradiction, terror and laughter, hunger and love, despair and creativity. Their stories remind us that even in humanity's darkest eras, children find ways to dream. The Dust Bowl stripped many children of what modern society considers normal childhood milestones. They should have spent afternoons learning music, exploring hobbies, and playing games. Instead, many worked long hours alongside adults, contributing to household survival. Their childhoods became labor-centered, and their futures reshaped by responsibilities that society would normally reserve for adults. On farms that remained functional, children woke before sunrise to haul water, feed starving livestock, and sweep barns. On hotter days, they soaked cloths and tied them across their mouths to avoid breathing dust. Teen boys plowed fields with aging equipment because fathers were too ill or exhausted. Younger girls cooked meals, washed clothes, mended torn shirts, and soothed siblings coughing through sleepless nights. Those who migrated west often took on labor as soon as they arrived. In California orchards, child workers pulled cotton sacks heavier than their bodies. They climbed ladders to pick fruit under scorching sun, fingers bleeding from thorns and splinters. Many lied about their age to earn wages. Their pay rarely exceeded a few cents per bucket. Money went straight to family food supplies. Education existed only when time allowed. Some children attended school sporadically, missing weeks to travel for seasonal crop harvests. Others dropped out entirely. Their parents hesitated, but understood survival came first. Many adults regretted the decision later, knowing lost education affected their children's lifelong opportunities. The emotional cost of this labor was enormous. Identity also evolved through religion and music. Many descendants continued singing folk songs passed down from Guthrie-era migrants. Churches with Dust Bowl origins maintained community ties that stretched across states. Annual reunions celebrated their shared past through music festivals, history lectures, quilting displays, and storytelling sessions. Conversely, descendants whose families stayed behind in the Great Plains developed a different cultural identity. They viewed themselves as rooted survivors who rebuild homes rather than fleeing. Their stories emphasized loyalty to land, endurance through storms, and love for prairie culture. Graves of ancestors remained nearby, symbolizing continuity. Both identities, migrant and rooted, carry pride today. Neither is superior. Both represent legitimate responses to disaster. Together, they create a rich tapestry of Dust Bowl heritage. The event also influenced economic mobility. Migrant families who settled in California found opportunities in manufacturing and wartime industry. Their descendants often entered universities and professional fields at higher rates than earlier generations. Meanwhile, descendants of plains farmers maintained agricultural traditions, passing farms down through siblings and cousins. Their identity reflected stewardship rather than relocation. The Dust Bowl also shaped humor, language, and storytelling patterns. Migrant families used slang born from camp life, while plains families maintained regional dialects influenced by isolation. Descendants today recognize shared jokes and expressions originating in hardship, terms describing dust storms, road life, and broke-down trucks. This cultural inheritance shows that the Dust Bowl did not simply produce trauma, it created identity. It connected families across states and across decades, giving them origin stories that shaped who they became. Not every Dust Bowl community recovered. Children watched their parents suffer humiliation at the hands of foremen or landlords. They learned early how economic inequality functioned, how workers were underpaid, how migrants were mocked, how employers used desperation to maintain cheap labor. Children grew up believing adulthood meant sacrifice and humiliation. Some older teens rebelled against hardship, sneaking away to city streets or railroad yards, hoping to escape responsibilities by hopping trains. But most returned days or weeks later, realizing survival outside family support was even harsher. Others joined the military when war approached in the early 1940s, eager to trade fields of dust for uniforms and steady meals. Despite sacrifice, Dust Bowl children developed skills that shaped adult success. They learned mechanics repairing truck engines on migration roads. They mastered teamwork building shelters from scrap wood. They learned to negotiate pay, calculate crop weights, and make decisions under pressure. Many who later became business owners, teachers, doctors, and soldiers credited Dust Bowl childhood lessons for their strength and determination. Still, it is impossible to ignore the collective loss. The opportunities stolen by economic disaster, drought, respiratory illness, and labor demands never returned. Childhood dreams, like becoming artists, inventors, or scholars, often faded beneath necessity. Their stories make clear that environmental disaster affects more than land. It reshapes generations. Dust Bowl children grew up faster than they should have. Their youth was spent beneath choking skies. Yet from that harsh upbringing emerged resilience that carried them through adulthood. When historians interview adults who once lived as children during the Dust Bowl, they describe lifelong memories thick with vivid imagery. The color of brown sky, the texture of gritty bread, and the feeling of dust beneath eyelids. They recall lying awake, listening to roofs creak beneath wind pressure, fearing the storm might rip their homes away. They remember stepping outside after storms to find sand piled against fences and windows like snowdrifts from another world. Psychologists studying trauma recognize that childhood experiences shape identity deeply, and Dust Bowl memories were difficult to escape. Many survivors reported recurring nightmares decades later, dreaming of suffocation and collapsing houses. Others described panic attacks triggered by ordinary weather, such as windy days or dry seasons. Some avoided beaches for their entire adult lives because blowing sand evoked storms from the past. For many, the trauma also involved grief. Children grew up surrounded by funerals, neighbors, friends, siblings, teachers. Many lost beloved pets to storms or starvation. Some babies were stillborn because pregnant mothers inhaled too much dust, and older siblings witnessed their parents' heartbreak. Trauma built layer upon layer until emotional numbness became a survival instinct. Yet, trauma also fueled motivation. Many Dust Bowl children vowed that their own families would never face such deprivation. They pursued education fiercely, served in the military to earn benefits, studied engineering and medicine, and entered professions far beyond farm life. Some became environmentalists, advocating for soil conservation to ensure that tragedy never repeated. Others wrote memoirs, turning suffering into testimony. The Dust Bowl generation contributed significantly to American society. They fought in World War II, entered booming post-war industries, participated in civil rights movements, and helped shape national culture. Their childhood lessons, resourcefulness, cooperation, gratitude, formed the backbone of their adult character. Family traditions evolved, too. Parents who had lived through the storms often taught their children to save leftovers, repair rather than replace belongings, and respect food. Many refused to waste water or bread, carrying habits learned from scarcity. Their children and grandchildren grew up hearing stories at kitchen tables, absorbing the weight of history one memory at a time. The legacy extended into national identity. The story of Dust Bowl youth became part of America's narrative of endurance, evidence that even children, the most vulnerable members of society, possess strength equal to the storms. Their memories remind us that history is personal. Behind every policy debate, every migration pattern, and every scientific achievement were children breathing dust, wiping tears, and dreaming through darkness. Their survival ensured that the Dust Bowl was not simply a story of destruction. It became a story of human endurance. The voices of these children carry forward today, telling future generations that hope does not grow from perfect circumstances. It grows from perseverance inside imperfection. As the Dust Bowl deepened and migration expanded, political tensions grew across the United States. What began as a local agricultural crisis evolved into a national confrontation between states' rights advocates, federal reform supporters, and agrarian communities who feared losing autonomy. The Dust Bowl forced America to reconsider the balance of political power, exposing weaknesses in government structures built for an earlier century. Western states, particularly California, reacted strongly to the arrival of thousands of migrants. Local leaders argued they lacked the financial resources to support sudden population growth. They demanded federal funds for hospital services, schooling, and policing, claiming their economies could collapse under the new strain. Some counties threatened to close their borders, and sheriffs stationed armed patrols along entry highways to turn migrants back. One event became notorious: the Bum Blockade of 1936, when California authorities set up checkpoints along the Nevada border, interrogating anyone who looked poor. Judges later ruled such actions unconstitutional, but the event revealed the tension between state security and individual freedom. Meanwhile, Plain states struggled to convince Washington that their problems could not be solved through traditional market recovery. Governors pleaded for drought relief, loan forgiveness, and direct aid. Some, however, resisted federal oversight. They argued that too much intervention might destroy local agricultural culture. Many farmers feared dependence on federal money, believing it threatened their independence. Rural newspapers debated whether federal involvement represented salvation or surrender. Franklin Roosevelt's administration saw the Dust Bowl as part of a broader crisis of capitalism and natural resource mismanagement. The New Deal proposed a revolutionary notion: that the federal government had a duty to protect citizens against environmental catastrophe. This idea deeply challenged American tradition. Before the 1930s, most federal policies avoided interfering with daily farm life. Now the government demanded soil conservation, offered financial control programs, and pushed land use reforms. Some lawmakers argued this was a dangerous expansion of power. They feared that federal farmland planning might lead to nationalized agriculture. Opponents of the New Deal accused Roosevelt of authoritarian tendencies, warning Americans that handing the government control over soil and crops would set precedent for control over factories, family wages, and education. Newspapers sympathetic to business leaders criticized conservation programs as wasteful and bureaucratic. Supporters of reform countered that ecological reality left no choice. Without coordinated national action, the plains would remain an environmental graveyard. They argued that poor farming practices had created dust storms powerful enough to darken skies over Washington, D.C. and drop dirt on ships in the Atlantic Ocean. If the federal government did nothing, the crisis could spread, threatening food distribution and trade networks across the country. The Dust Bowl reshaped political identities. Farmers who once leaned conservative began supporting Roosevelt because his programs helped them survive. Meanwhile, some Democrats defected from the New Deal, worried that government programs would outlive the crisis and permanently change American culture. Ultimately, the Dust Bowl raised fundamental questions. Where did the federal government's responsibility begin, and where did it end? Were states entitled to expel migrants to protect resources? Should soil be treated as private property or as a national asset? These questions did not disappear when the rains returned. The politics of the Dust Bowl permanently changed American expectations of government, planting the seeds for modern environmental regulation, farm subsidies, and federal disaster response programs. The crisis showed the nation that individual effort alone could not stop climate disaster. Collective power had to replace isolation. The New Deal introduced sweeping economic and environmental programs in hopes of saving rural America. But these changes came with mixed results. Some initiatives rescued families. Others sparked anger, confusion, or unintended harm. Understanding this complexity reveals the Dust Bowl not only as a human tragedy, but as a proving ground for American policy experimentation. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration, AAA, remains one of the most controversial programs. It attempted to stabilize farm prices by reducing production, paying farmers to destroy crops or leave land unplanted. In theory, this would raise prices and restore farmer income. But critics argued it contradicted logic. Why destroy food in an age of hunger? Photographs of thousands of slaughtered pigs, killed under AAA orders, spread across newspapers, causing outrage. Many Americans could not accept government waste while children starved. Yet in the long term, AAA succeeded economically. Crop prices rose, stopping financial collapse in multiple states. The real conflict was emotional rather than economic. Farmers felt conflicted receiving money for not farming. Still, they accepted payment because survival demanded it. The Resettlement Administration, RA, attempted to relocate families from infertile areas to better soil. This was perhaps the most ambitious social experiment of the decade, and one that suffered frequent rejection. Many families refused to leave ancestral land. Those who did often discovered resettlement towns poorly funded or culturally unfamiliar. Some RA communities succeeded. Others fell apart within months as residents clashed with officials over rules and expectations. The Works Progress Administration, WPA, by contrast, became widely beloved. WPA jobs gave men work building roads, schools, libraries, water systems, and public parks. These projects did more than pay wages. They produced pride. Men who felt useless on dying farms now built structures that still stand today. WPA writers documented oral histories, preserving stories that would otherwise have vanished. WPA artists created murals celebrating farm life and workers. The program helped restore dignity where broken soil had taken it away. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, offered similar relief for young men, teaching forestry skills and paying wages sent home to families. Camps provided food, education, and community, preventing thousands of youths from drifting into homelessness. Many former CCC members later credited the program with saving them from desperation and crime. Still, not every New Deal experiment succeeded. Some programs were short-lived due to political backlash. Business owners feared unionization, landowners disliked regulation, and Southern politicians resisted racial equality clauses. Women often felt excluded because labor projects focused on male employment. Non-white farmers and native communities saw minimal benefit from initial programs, reflecting systemic inequalities not prioritized at the time. But it is undeniable that the New Deal's Dust Bowl response reshaped national identity. It created the foundation of modern farm policy, crop insurance, rural electrification, and environmental research. It proved that government could adapt to crisis with creativity, even if results were imperfect. Most importantly, it demonstrated that large-scale disaster required collective, structured response rather than reliance on individual sacrifice alone. The Dust Bowl era taught lawmakers that agricultural policy must be dynamic. Weather, soil chemistry, population, and economy were intertwined. Ignoring one risked destroying all. Through trials and mistakes, the New Deal forged new political landscapes, ones that still influence American life today. Politics during the Dust Bowl were shaped not only by legislation, but by media-driven ideological conflict. The public formed opinions through newspapers, radio broadcasts, speeches, and artistic portrayals. The narrative surrounding the Dust Bowl was constantly contested. Some saw migrants as victims deserving compassion. Others saw them as irresponsible settlers who pushed land beyond limits. Conservative newspapers argued that federal programs threatened capitalism. They warned readers that soil regulations were only the beginning, predicting that private property rights would collapse under bureaucratic control. Editorials accused Roosevelt of using Dust Bowl suffering to expand federal authority. Rumors circulated that conservation programs were socialist experiments disguised as science. Political cartoons mocked tree planting projects and questioned whether the government could control weather better than farmers. Meanwhile, New Deal supporting newspapers emphasized environmental responsibility and social justice. They described soil erosion as a national shame, writing that farmers needed education rather than criticism. Writers portrayed Okies as hardworking victims of nature and economic corruption. They printed photographs of gaunt children to persuade Americans that intervention was moral duty. Radio broadcasts intensified this ideological divide. Conservative radio hosts blamed drought on natural climate cycles, arguing that storms would have come regardless of farming technique. Progressive broadcasters countered that human greed created fertile fields and destroyed prairies. They read migrant letters on air, making suffering undeniable to listeners thousands of miles away. Literature also shaped political opinion. Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath framed migration as a humanitarian emergency, portraying California growers as exploiters. Politicians condemned the novel as communist propaganda, claiming it exaggerated conditions and insulted local economies. Yet the book inspired sympathy across northern and eastern states, revealing power struggles between regional interests. Scientists added another layer to ideological debate. Soil experts challenged superstition-driven beliefs, such as rain following the plow or divine punishment theories, by offering evidence-based explanations. For many farmers, this sparked identity conflict. They wanted solutions, but accepting science meant admitting generations of agricultural practice have been flawed. Despite ideological battles, one truth prevailed. The Dust Bowl demanded national attention. Public opinion eventually leaned towards support of relief because people could not ignore daily reports of dust clouds darkening cities, students suffocating in classrooms, and Midwestern skies turning black. Political commentators later observed that the Dust Bowl crisis accelerated America's transition from isolated rural communities into a shared national consciousness. It encouraged Americans to see themselves as part of a larger ecosystem, affected by distant decisions and weather patterns. The Dust Bowl became a testing ground not only for environmental policy, but for American democracy itself. The nation learned that political narratives could either divide or unite. In this case, the struggle produced lasting reforms and broadened understanding of environmental responsibility. Although the Dust Bowl shattered the economic foundation of farming regions, it did not eliminate the human instinct to adapt. Across the Great Plains, entire towns and counties reinvented their identities, transforming from purely agricultural landscapes into diversified communities built on social cooperation and emotional endurance. This reinvention took place slowly through trial and error and through countless conversations around kitchen tables and community halls. When storms persisted and fields failed, people began reimagining how to live rather than surrendering to despair. Some communities established cooperative farming groups. Farmers who could no longer afford individual equipment pooled their tractors and plows into shared use. They rotated ownership hours and split harvest profits. For generations, farming had been an individual pursuit, but crisis reshaped culture. Shared labor reduced equipment expenses and created a sense of unity. Neighbors who once competed for yields now worked side by side. Other towns formed barter systems to replace cash currency. Carpenters exchanged work for eggs. Teachers traded reading lessons for clothing repairs. Ranchers traded milk for bread. These were not organized by banks or government agencies. They emerged naturally as survival responses. Families who had little money discovered they still possessed skills valuable to others. In many towns, community barns hosted weekly barter exchanges. People gathered not only to trade goods, but to share news and laughter. This revived social spirit helped residents maintain dignity when banks' accounts ran empty. Churches evolved into support networks far beyond religious function. They organized soup kitchens, childcare groups, clothing exchanges, and food delivery teams. Pastors encouraged congregations to look after widows, elders, and the sick. Members built ramps for disabled neighbors, shared firewood, and gathered blankets for families whose houses leaked dust. Church basements filled with donated canned food, while pastors delivered sermons emphasizing love over judgment. This spiritual resilience strengthened emotional bonds. Women's clubs, quilting circles, and home demonstration groups also became powerful community forces. Women had always shaped Plains culture quietly, but during the Dust Bowl, their work became indispensable. Sewing groups repaired clothing for entire neighborhoods. Kitchen collectives experimented with affordable recipes, creating new meals from dried vegetables and minimal ingredients. Women also organized educational programs teaching sanitation, medical care, and nutrition, helping reduce illness during dusty months. Meanwhile, young people sustained community identity through sports and music. Baseball leagues formed in evenings, offering entertainment after exhausting days. Thousands of farms and rural towns were permanently abandoned. Their remains form a silent archaeology across the plains. Ruined schoolhouses, collapsed barns, rusted fuel pumps, broken fences, and foundations half buried beneath shifting soil. These ghost landscapes reveal physical scars that survived even after rain returned. Archaeologists and historians study these remnants to understand the human geography of disaster. They examine where houses once stood, how families arranged rooms to block dust, and where wells and windmills once operated. Some excavations uncover everyday objects, coffee cans, rusted spoons, broken harmonicas, that tell stories about lives interrupted by storms. Certain towns simply vanished when residents fled west. Businesses closed, church bells fell silent, and roads cracked beneath drifting sand. Town names disappeared from maps, remembered only in county records and family memories. Modern travelers sometimes stumble across these forgotten places, seeing an abandoned grain elevator rising from prairie grass like a headstone marking lost civilization. These physical ruins remind us that the Dust Bowl was not temporary challenge, but permanent transformation. When population migrated west, economic networks crumbled. Schools shut because no children attended. Doctors left once patients disappeared. Railroads that supplied small towns rerouted toward new cities. The land itself speaks. Deep gullies carved by erosion remain visible from the air. Sand dunes mark where topsoil once supported wheat. Fence lines half submerged in earth reveal how high drifts once piled against barns. Some areas have been preserved intentionally to educate tourists about disaster impact. Others simply remain quiet, untouched for decades, letting prairie winds speak through broken windows. Games were often played on dirt fields surrounded by dunes, yet families came to watch, cheering beneath handkerchief masks. Musicians played folk songs in barns or school auditoriums, using music to replace silence with hope. In some towns, public libraries became places of emotional refuge. Reading offered escape. Children dove into adventure novels, while adults read farming manuals or newspapers reporting rainfall forecasts. Libraries hosted storytelling nights where parents and children sat on wooden benches, listening to traveling lecturers describe science, government programs, or world events. These transformed communities proved that survival required more than scientific soil repair. It required human connection. The Dust Bowl threatened to isolate every family, yet communal action created networks stronger than dust storms. While the environment battered their homes, people rebuilt their social foundations. In doing so, they preserved something storms could never destroy: their collective identity. Crises often lead people to question their beliefs, and the Dust Bowl era was no exception. As storms grew worse and lives unraveled, spiritual interpretation filled conversations. Churches across the plains saw a rise in attendance, not because religion solved environmental conditions, but because it helped residents process fear and grief. Faith became an anchor that steadied emotional well-being and offered the possibility of meaning behind suffering. Some viewed the Dust Bowl as divine punishment, proof that society had strayed from moral discipline. Ministers preached that greed, arrogance, and neglect of nature had provoked God's anger. They cited biblical drought stories, including Jeremiah's lament for dry fields and Elijah's challenge to the prophets of Baal. Congregations listened, searching for moral clarity. These sermons provided a psychological explanation for chaos, allowing people to believe disaster had purpose rather than randomness. Other churches preached compassion rather than guilt. Ministers argued that the Dust Bowl was not punishment, but trial, an opportunity for renewal and humility. They encouraged believers to see storms as reminders that humans depended on each other and on the environment. This perspective softened harshness, embracing empathy instead of shame. Religious identity varied across the plains, shaping reactions differently. Catholic communities organized charity funds and saint feast gatherings. Lutheran congregations held choir performances to lift spirits. Baptists hosted revival meetings, where emotional testimonies filled dusty air with passionate hymns. Pentecostal groups, some of the fastest growing at the time, emphasized healing through prayer, believing spiritual power could protect lungs and livestock. At the same time, skepticism grew. People who had prayed for years without rainfall began questioning traditional faith. Some stopped attending church, believing storms were scientific rather than supernatural. Others embraced secular hope, conservation, Roosevelt's policies, and grassroots cooperation. The Dust Bowl pushed Americans to reconsider how faith coexisted with science. Children formed unique spiritual understandings. They asked if God lived above the storms or inside them. Some wondered why God made dust that hurt babies. Sunday school teachers struggled to explain suffering without frightening young minds. Yet many children remember faith gatherings as sources of comfort. Singing hymns drowned out wind howls, and praying together built unity. In migrant camps, faith evolved into multi-denominational culture. Camp revivals welcomed Catholic, Protestant, and non-religious participants sitting side by side. People prayed for strength rather than rain. Services blended music, storytelling, and emotional support. Camp chaplains organized group funerals for families who could not afford ceremonies. The Dust Bowl revealed religion not as a single path, but as many. It provided comfort, identity, unity, and sometimes conflict. But most importantly, it preserved hope. When storms blocked the sun, faith kept communities from collapsing psychologically. Even skeptics acknowledged its role in emotional endurance. In this way, the Dust Bowl reshaped American spirituality, pushing people to blend science with faith, realism with optimism, and despair with meaning. Amid hardship, Dust Bowl communities rediscovered the importance of education. Knowledge became more than a luxury. It became a tool for survival. Parents encouraged children to stay in school when possible, knowing that education offered pathways beyond farming. Even families who could barely afford clothing or books made sacrifices to keep children learning. Schools adapted to crisis with creativity. Teachers integrated dust storm science into lessons, explaining air pressure, evaporation, and soil erosion to curious students. Biology classes analyzed plant resilience, giving students practical knowledge about gardening and survival. History teachers compared the Dust Bowl to ancient droughts in Egypt and Mesopotamia, reminding children that humanity had faced disaster before and endured. Libraries served as community classrooms. Reading circles formed around borrowed books. Debates emerged about government policy. Students analyzed newspapers describing Roosevelt speeches. Some teachers turned to correspondence education, mailing assignments to students who lived too far to walk during storms. Others visited children at home to check homework and provide encouragement. Education also expanded culturally. Many Dust Bowl migrants wrote poetry, composed songs, and created artwork expressing their experiences. Teachers preserved these materials, recognizing that cultural expression mattered as much as mathematics or grammar. Adult education programs emerged through federal initiatives. Soil conservation agents held seminars teaching farmers new plowing techniques. Homemaker groups taught cooking with limited ingredients. Mechanics taught men and boys how to repair trucks and tractors using scrap metal. Literacy programs helped adults read government forms, letters, and financial documents. These educational advancements strengthened communities long after storms subsided. Children who learned science later entered universities, studying ecology, medicine, engineering, and meteorology. Many returned to the plains as professionals, improving towns with skills unavailable during the 1930s. Yet education struggled against poverty. Many children lacked shoes or winter coats. Lunch programs were impossible when cafeterias had no supplies. Some parents resisted schooling because children were needed in fields or cotton rows. Migrant children especially suffered constant interruption, often attending 4 or 5 schools in a single year, or none at all. Still, the Dust Bowl taught Americans that knowledge protects society. Education inspired curiosity, innovation, and adaptability. It equipped a new generation to question myth, reject harmful farming methods, and embrace science-based environmental stewardship. The Dust Bowl proved that while soil can blow away, ideas endure. By 1938, after nearly a decade of drought and endless wind erosion, signs of environmental change finally began appearing across the Great Plains. For many residents, these early hints of rainfall felt unreal, like waking from a nightmare they feared might never end. Clouds formed more frequently. Storm fronts drifted over fields that had not tasted moisture in years. Thunder cracked across skies once silent with dust. Grassroots felt the first drops of revival, and farmers watched cautiously as the land began breathing again. The return of rain did not occur in a single dramatic moment. It unfolded slowly, season by season, region by region. Meteorologists later explained that large-scale climate cycles were shifting bringing wetter air currents from the Gulf of Mexico and Pacific. The jet stream, which had weakened during the early 1930s, returned to normal patterns, helping storms penetrate deeper into the plains. Environmental scientists also believe that soil conservation work reduced dust intensity, allowing clouds to form more easily because airborne particles no longer disrupted raindrop formation. The psychological effect of rainfall was immediate. Families ran outside during the first showers, lifting their faces to the sky, allowing mud to splash beneath their feet. Newspapers printed rainfall totals with celebration. Church bells rang in small towns. For the first time in years, the smell of fresh earth replaced the bitter scent of dust. Children danced in muddy fields. Farmers plunged their hands into wet soil, feeling hope for the first time since their harvest died. But rainfall did not erase the damage. Hills still appeared scarred by erosion. Lakes and ponds took years to refill. Livestock remained scarce. Plowed fields lay uneven and broken. Yet, the return of moisture encouraged farmers to plant again. Wheat seeds sprouted in places where soil conservation had taken root. Green emerged across brown plains, not uniformly, but persistently. Residents described it as color returning to the world. Rainfall also exposed wounds. Towns had shrunk dramatically. Thousands who migrated west never returned. Farmhouses stood abandoned. Roofs caved under years of storms. Cemeteries held rows of graves for children lost to disease. Still, farmers planted through grief, believing that new harvests could rebuild what storms destroyed. Government agencies continued conservation work even as weather improved. Soil experts warned farmers that rainfall alone would not save the plains. Without continued contour plowing, grass regeneration, and diversification, history might repeat itself. Farmers listened. They had lived through the worst ecological collapse in American history. Few wanted to risk another. Schools and newspapers repeated warnings. Rain is blessing, not guarantee. By 1939, portions of Kansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, and Texas reported harvest success unseen since the early 1920s. Wheat prices climbed. Granaries opened. Families purchased new tools. Merchants expanded stock. Land regained partial dignity. However, not every area improved immediately. Some pockets remained barren until the early 1940s. In these regions, soil loss during storms could never return, making farming impractical. Scientists warned these towns that relocation or land use change might be necessary. Some transitioned to ranching. Others planted drought-resistant crops like sorghum. Still, the symbolic triumph of rainfall marked a turning point. For the first time in nearly a decade, residents believed nature might give back what it had taken. They saw restoration not as miracle, but as partnership between sky and soil, science and sweat. The plains began transforming again, no longer Dust Bowl wasteland, but a landscape learning to live with balance. The return of rain reshaped more than landscape. It reshaped identity. Communities that had survived years of storms faced emotional questions. Could they trust the sky again? Could they rebuild what was lost? Would future children inherit a better world or face the same danger? Hope became visible in everyday behavior. People repaired barns that had been left broken. They painted shutters that had faded beneath blowing grit. Windows once sealed against dust were open to let breeze through kitchens. Children returned to outdoor play, rolling in grass rather than dust dunes. Farmers dug irrigation ditches, planted vegetable gardens, and invested in livestock again. Weddings increased. Couples who delayed marriage due to hardship now felt ready to start families. Churches recorded baptism surges. Local fairs reopened, showcasing quilts, pies, and livestock once again. Even baseball leagues resumed regular games. Rural social life, long silent, found voice and rhythm, but hope coexisted with skepticism. Many older farmers refused to celebrate prematurely. They told younger generations that the land had turned once before and could turn again. Their caution was shaped by memory, a memory of dust clouds swallowing daylight, of children coughing through nights, of cattle starving on cracked plains. They taught that vigilance mattered more than optimism. Trust issues were not limited to weather. Migrants who had gone west faced difficult decisions about returning home. Some longed to reunite with family lands, now showing signs of life. Others feared reliving trauma. For California workers who had suffered humiliation, prejudice, and poverty, the idea of returning to the plains brought mixed emotion. They wondered if home still existed in recognizable form. Some returned and rebuilt. Others stayed in California permanently, having found new identity working in industry, shipping, oil, and wartime manufacturing. Migration had reshaped national demographics permanently. Among those who stayed in the plains throughout the storm era, emotional scars remained. Nightmares persisted. Anxiety triggered by wind, sounds continued daily. People could not see dust motes floating in late sunlight without feeling unease. Even decades later, many residents admitted they still covered food and water instinctively, afraid dust would contaminate meals. Still, overcoming tragedy bound communities together. People told stories around dinner tables, describing how rain smelled the first day, how cattle drank eagerly from refilled streams, and how fields glowed silver under thunderstorms. These stories served as cultural memory, teaching younger generations that resilience grows not from perfect conditions, but from perseverance through hardship. The return of moisture also strengthened scientific belief. Farmers began respecting weather predictions and soil studies. They trusted meteorologists, whose drought warnings now carried credibility. Schools taught conservation science alongside mathematics and reading. Environmental pride replaced agricultural arrogance. In essence, the slow revival of the plains was both physical and spiritual. It reminded communities that nature can destroy, but also heal. It taught them to hold gratitude and caution side by side. The Dust Bowl generation carried its survival lessons forward. Rain renewed crops, yes, but it also renewed the spirit. By the early 1940s, a complex convergence of events transformed the Great Plains. Rainfall increased, farming techniques improved, and soil erosion decreased. But another major force accelerated agricultural recovery: World War II. When global conflict erupted, food demand skyrocketed. The same wheat fields that once produced dust now produce grain essential to the war effort. Agriculture surged forward, not just out of environmental luck, but because economic need pushed it. Government programs encouraged maximum production for troops overseas and allies abroad. Farmers who had nearly abandoned land now found their harvests feeding soldiers in Europe and the Pacific. Grain prices rose, making farming profitable again. Agricultural machinery advanced through wartime engineering, producing stronger tractors, better irrigation pumps, and more efficient harvesters. Farmers who once plowed with aging equipment now own technology unthinkable a decade earlier. Young men who joined the military left farms temporarily, but their labor gaps were filled by women, older farmers, and migrant workers. Farm communities learned flexibility and teamwork. Rural factories produced tractors, fertilizer, irrigation pipe, and storage silos. Wartime industry offered income to families formerly dependent solely on agriculture. The Dust Bowl's ecological wounds healed unevenly. Some areas regained high productivity, others remained fragile. But by the war's midpoint, Dust Bowl imagery began fading from newspapers and radio broadcasts, replaced by wartime victories and global politics. Yet memory remained strong. Farmers implemented conservation rigorously because they had lived through disaster. They rotated crops, managed livestock grazing carefully, and avoided reckless land expansion. Many refused to plow marginal land, even when wartime prices tempted them. Their trauma served as restraint. The war also changed national perspective. Rural America now felt connected to global history. Dust Bowl farmers, once isolated and forgotten, became contributors to victory. Their wheat fed armies, their sons fought battles, their daughters worked in wartime factories. This pride reshaped identity. Migration slowed, and towns regained population stability. World War II inadvertently finished what the New Deal started. It turned agricultural recovery into national necessity, converting hardship into strength. By the mid-1940s, the Dust Bowl era was ending. Not because dust storms disappeared entirely, but because society had evolved. The land was stronger, the people were wiser, and the nation recognized that environmental protection mattered as much as industrial power. The Dust Bowl remained a scar on American history, but also a lesson that guided agricultural decisions for generations to come. Before the Dust Bowl, most Americans viewed drought as a temporary inconvenience, a natural hardship to endure, like winter blizzards or brief crop failures. Few people understood long-term climate cycles, and even fewer believed human actions could influence environmental disaster. The Dust Bowl shattered that worldview. As scientists began studying the 1930s drought in depth, they uncovered patterns that revealed a more complex relationship between atmosphere, soil, heat, and global weather circulation. Their discoveries reshaped modern climate science and changed how Americans understood the forces shaping their world. Meteorologists studying the Dust Bowl identified large-scale interactions involving the jet stream, ocean temperatures, and land surface feedback loop. They explained that in the early 1930s, the northern jet stream weakened and shifted northward, preventing moist air from the Gulf of Mexico from reaching the plains. Without regular storm systems, soil dried, leaving crops vulnerable and reducing evaporation, which normally feeds cloud formation. This cycle intensified drought conditions across a vast region. Scientists also noted that the absence of vegetation accelerated atmospheric heating. Bare soil reflected sunlight differently than grass-covered earth. This altered surface temperature and reduced humidity levels. Even thunderstorms that formed above the Rockies disappeared before reaching Kansas and Oklahoma. The land had quit producing atmospheric moisture, meaning storms died before birth. These discoveries challenged an older belief widely taught in the 19th century: rain follows the plow. Settlers have been told that farming itself created rainfall, that breaking soil and planting crops released moisture and warmth into the atmosphere. They believed plowing prairie grass would convert arid plains into farmland permanently. But the Dust Bowl proved the opposite. Plowing millions of acres destroyed natural grass systems that once protected soil and stored moisture. Without deep-rooted vegetation anchoring ground and holding water, drought conditions spread faster than anyone predicted. Scientific understanding of the disaster unfolded slowly. Early in the crisis, some skeptics argued the storms were unavoidable freaks of nature. When drought ended and migration slowed, plains towns faced a new question: how to rebuild. The dust storms had not only damaged homes, they had devastated schools, hospitals, roads, libraries, and cultural institutions. Many communities resembled skeletons of their former selves. Reconstruction required imagination, funding, and cooperation between citizens and government. Schools served as the heart of Reconstruction. In the 1930s, hundreds of schools had closed or merged due to population loss. Buildings sat empty, damaged by wind erosion and neglect. After rainfall returned, towns focused on reopening education centers. With federal support, school boards hired new teachers, repaired leaking roofs, and replaced broken windows. Classrooms modernized. Electricity expanded into rural districts, giving students lighting for winter study. Libraries acquired new books, including scientific research about soil and ecology. Gymnasiums reopened for sports, reviving community spirit. Children who had spent their youth indoors during dust storms finally enjoyed outdoor recess and physical education. Hospitals underwent major renovation. Facilities strengthened ventilation systems, installed new sanitation equipment, and expanded maternity wards. Medical leaders pushed for public health reforms to address long-term dust-related illness. Pneumonia wards, once overflowing, shifted toward preventative medicine and nutrition education. Infrastructure reconstruction extended to roads and transportation. Dust storms had eroded gravel routes and buried farm lanes. crews cleared sand, leveled surfaces, and applied oil coatings to prevent future erosion. Bridges rebuilt after flood and dust damage reconnected isolated towns. Improved roads allowed farmers to transport goods efficiently, strengthening regional economies. Cultural spaces revived slowly but meaningfully. Community theaters reopened, offering plays and concerts that celebrated recovery. Churches upgraded heating systems and meeting halls to accommodate growing congregations. Town squares once buried in dust were landscaped with newly planted trees, symbolic reminders of perseverance. Local newspapers, once near extinction, regained readership. Editors documented progress, published rainfall records, and shared stories of families returning home. Newspapers also preserved community memory, ensuring that future generations understood the struggle behind rebuilt walls and paved roads. Economic rebuilding remained complicated. Businesses struggled to secure loans. Banks, once cautious to lend after seeing thousands fail, gradually reopened credit lines. Government funds helped merchants purchase new stock and equipment. Grocery stores, hardware shops, and clothing outlets reemerged. New businesses appeared too: auto repair shops, radio sellers, and electric appliance stores. Industrial technology left behind by World War II filtered into rural America, transforming domestic life. Homes gained refrigerators instead of cellars, radios instead of silence, tractors instead of mule teams. Rebuilding also strengthened regional identity. Towns organized heritage festivals celebrating prairie culture, including folk music, rodeos, quilting displays, and wheat harvest parades. These events restored pride and collective ownership of the past. The reconstruction of Dust Bowl towns proved that survival extends beyond breathing and eating. It requires places to gather, to learn, to celebrate, and to dream. Communities that once seemed doomed reinvented themselves, turning wounds into anchors of unity. The Dust Bowl remains one of the most defining events in American history, not only because of the destruction it caused, but because of the lessons it forced the nation to learn about itself. Cultural spaces revived slowly but meaningfully. Community theaters reopened, offering plays and concerts that celebrated recovery. Churches upgraded heating systems and meeting halls to accommodate growing congregations. Town squares once buried in dust were landscaped with newly planted trees, symbolic reminders of perseverance. Local newspapers, once near extinction, regained readership. Editors documented progress, published rainfall records, and shared stories of families returning home. Newspapers also preserved community memory, ensuring that future generations understood the struggle behind rebuilt walls and paved roads. Economic rebuilding remained complicated. Businesses struggled to secure loans. Banks, once cautious to lend after seeing thousands fail, gradually reopened credit lines. Government funds helped merchants purchase new stock and equipment. Grocery stores, hardware shops, and clothing outlets reemerged. New businesses appeared too: auto repair shops, radio sellers, and electric appliance stores. Industrial technology left behind by World War II filtered into rural America, transforming domestic life. Homes gained refrigerators instead of cellars, radios instead of silence, tractors instead of mule teams. Rebuilding also strengthened regional identity. Towns organized heritage festivals celebrating prairie culture, including folk music, rodeos, quilting displays, and wheat harvest parades. These events restored pride and collective ownership of the past. The reconstruction of Dust Bowl towns proved that survival extends beyond breathing and eating. It requires places to gather, to learn, to celebrate, and to dream. Communities that once seemed doomed reinvented themselves, turning wounds into anchors of unity. The Dust Bowl remains one of the most defining events in American history, not only because of the destruction it caused, but because of the lessons it forced the nation to learn about itself. It challenged cultural mythology, economic values, scientific assumptions, and political identity. By the time the last dust clouds settled, America had changed permanently. The people who lived through it became mirrors reflecting strengths, weaknesses, and potential future mistakes. One central lesson involved humility. Before the disaster, many plain settlers believed the land existed to be shaped according to human will. They believed in manifest destiny, agricultural entitlement, and industrial expansion without limits. But the storms revealed that nature possesses authority far greater than human ambition. The Dust Bowl taught the nation that success requires cooperation with environmental systems, not dominance over them. This changed how Americans viewed land, turning soil into a shared inheritance rather than private commodity. Another lesson involved community strength. The Dust Bowl exposed how isolated communities struggled alone, but also how they survived through collective effort. Shared tools, food exchange, mutual aid networks, church support groups, and volunteer rescue efforts prove that social connection matters more than individual achievement. In a nation that praised independence, the crisis revealed interdependence as the truer virtue. The Dust Bowl also forced the United States to reconsider the meaning of federal responsibility. Before the 1930s, the idea that government should protect citizens from environmental disasters seemed radical. Many argued that suffering was personal responsibility, not public concern. Yet when drought devastated crops and the economy collapsed, federal intervention became unavoidable. Programs like the Soil Conservation Service, CCC, WPA, and AAA proved that structured assistance could prevent catastrophe. This shaped modern expectations. Today, federal disaster relief exists because the Dust Bowl showed why it must. The crisis redefined the American dream. No longer tied solely to land ownership, success became linked to education, mobility, and social opportunity. Former farmers became engineers, teachers, industrial workers, and community leaders. They demonstrated that reinvention is essential to survival. The Dust Bowl also taught Americans to respect science. Meteorology, ecology, soil biology, and conservation research grew from necessity. Farmers learned that intuition alone could not manage land. They embraced crop rotation, contour plowing, and drought-resistant planting because scientific evidence replaced superstition. This acceptance of research paved the way for future environmental protections and agricultural modernization. Finally, the Dust Bowl exposed inequality. Migrants faced prejudice, exploitation, and class barriers. These injustices sparked early conversations about labor rights, migrant protection, fair wages, and education access. Conversations that later shaped civil rights activism. Together, these lessons formed a national narrative. America survives because it adapts. It thrives because it learns. And it grows stronger when it listens to those who lived through suffering. Although nearly a century has passed, the Dust Bowl continues influencing modern culture, science, politics, and environmental awareness. The crisis remains relevant because its core themes, climate vulnerability, human responsibility, migration, economic instability, and social resilience, mirror challenges facing the world right now. Climate researchers study Dust Bowl weather patterns to understand drought cycles in Africa, Asia, California, and the American Southwest. Satellite data, wind maps, and soil studies reveal frightening similarities between past and present. Many regions today face deforestation, desertification, groundwater depletion, and unsustainable farming. The Dust Bowl serves as a global warning. When humans harm ecosystems, nature responds. Modern droughts in Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas echo the past. Dry years still spark dust storms, though less severe thanks to conservation methods born from 1930s lessons. These storms remind people that history never truly ends. It leaves shadows. Farmers now monitor soil moisture, watch satellite forecasts, and diversify crops to avoid past mistakes. The Dust Bowl also remains important because of migration. Current refugee crises caused by war, poverty, climate change, and famine mirror Dust Bowl displacement. The global community debates responsibility. Who should help displace people? How should nations respond to climate migrants? The Dust Bowl offers historical perspective. It shows how displacement harms identity, but also reshapes opportunity. Cultural interest in the Dust Bowl has not faded. Historians, musicians, filmmakers, and novelists still retell the era through art. School curriculums analyze primary sources from Dust Bowl children. Researchers examine diaries for insight into trauma, survival, and memory. Ken Burns' documentary revived national discussion, reminding viewers that the U.S. once faced climate collapse on its own soil. Environmentally, the Dust Bowl helped shape modern laws. Soil conservation districts, crop insurance, water use policies, and farm subsidy programs evolved from New Deal legislation. Without this history, American agriculture might still operate under unsustainable practices. The Dust Bowl is also relevant because it challenges assumptions about progress. Today, technology gives humans confidence in their control over nature. Yet climate events, hurricanes, wildfires, floods, show nature still holds immense power. The Dust Bowl reveals that disaster occurs not only from natural forces, but from hubris, mismanagement, and short-sighted policy. The Dust Bowl matters socially as well. It reminds America that poverty is not personal failure. It is often structural, caused by economic systems or environmental collapse. Migrants were hardworking people, not stereotypes. Their suffering teaches empathy today as new migrant populations arrive from Central America, Africa, and the Middle East under similar circumstances. In all these ways, the Dust Bowl lives on, not just in memory, but in action. It influences how nations plan for climate change, how farmers treat soil, how governments approach welfare, and how communities view outsiders. History matters because memory prevents repetition. The Dust Bowl proves that forgetting can be dangerous, and remembering can be life-saving. Beyond statistics, beyond policy, and beyond environmental analysis, the Dust Bowl ultimately remains a human story. It is a narrative of ordinary people facing extraordinary hardship. People who woke each morning to gritty air, who watched children fall sick, who buried livestock, and sometimes family members beneath choking skies, who packed trucks and migrated because staying meant starvation. Their story is not simply about soil. It is about dignity, identity, courage, and hope. The Dust Bowl teaches that tragedy exposes human truth. Wealth disappears, land becomes useless, and social status collapses, but character remains visible. Families cared for neighbors even while hungry themselves. Teachers risked health to keep schools open. Doctors treated children through dust pneumonia epidemics with limited medicine. Musicians sang to keep spirits alive. Mothers held families together through emotional sacrifice. The Dust Bowl matters socially as well. It reminds America that poverty is not personal failure. It is often structural, caused by economic systems or environmental collapse. Migrants were hardworking people, not stereotypes. Their suffering teaches empathy today as new migrant populations arrive from Central America, Africa, and the Middle East under similar circumstances. In all these ways, the Dust Bowl lives on, not just in memory, but in action. It influences how nations plan for climate change, how farmers treat soil, how governments approach welfare, and how communities view outsiders. History matters because memory prevents repetition. The Dust Bowl proves that forgetting can be dangerous, and remembering can be life-saving. Beyond statistics, beyond policy, and beyond environmental analysis, the Dust Bowl ultimately remains a human story. It is a narrative of ordinary people facing extraordinary hardship. People who woke each morning to gritty air, who watched children fall sick, who buried livestock, and sometimes family members beneath choking skies, who packed trucks and migrated because staying meant starvation. Their story is not simply about soil. It is about dignity, identity, courage, and hope. The Dust Bowl teaches that tragedy exposes human truth. Wealth disappears, land becomes useless, and social status collapses, but character remains visible. Families cared for neighbors even while hungry themselves. Teachers risked health to keep schools open. Doctors treated children through dust pneumonia epidemics with limited medicine. Musicians sang to keep spirits alive. Mothers held families together through emotional sacrifice. This human resilience transforms the Dust Bowl from environmental disaster into moral lesson. It demonstrates that hope exists not because conditions are perfect, but because people refuse to surrender to despair. They adapt, they learn, they love through hardship, they continue. The story also invites deeper reflection on identity. The Dust Bowl generation never forgot their roots. Even after moving west, migrants remembered wheat harvest smells, prairie sunsets, and thunder rolling across flat Earth. They taught their children to honor heritage, even if they never returned to Oklahoma or Kansas. Identity outlived geography. The Dust Bowl reminds us that humanity is fragile and strong at once. Fragile because lungs cannot breathe dust, farms cannot survive drought, and lives can collapse overnight. Strong because communities rebuild, children grow, and families reroot in strange landscapes. Perhaps the greatest meaning of the Dust Bowl lies in perspective. Modern readers look at societies facing climate disasters today, rising seas in island nations, drought in Africa, wildfires in Australia and California, and recognize universal struggle. The Dust Bowl shows that suffering can produce wisdom, empathy, and change. It reminds today's world that people are capable of building beauty after destruction. Finally, the Dust Bowl remains powerful because it was never simply about failure. It was about transformation. It reshaped America's economy, science, laws, agriculture, identity, and imagination. It proved that history is not a straight line, but a spiral. Events return in new forms until societies learn their lessons. The Dust Bowl story ends not in defeat, but in rebirth. Rain returned, land healed, children grew, migrants built new communities, descendants flourished, memories evolved from agony into legacy. That enduring legacy ensures the Dust Bowl will never fade from historical consciousness. It stands as both warning and inspiration, a testament to human endurance and a reminder that the future depends on how society remembers the past. You have just heard one of the most powerful and heartbreaking chapters of American history, the Dust Bowl. Today we learned how nature, when pushed too far, pushed back even harder. We saw how mistakes in farming and land use created storms that nearly erased the Great Plains. We listened to the voices of migrants, farmers, children, mothers, and workers who refused to surrender to despair. We discovered how drought, dust, hunger, disease, and fear shaped millions of lives, and how those same storms also built courage, community, music, science, and new dreams. We saw how America transformed, from plows to conservation, from pride to understanding, from farm identity to industrial labor, from local tragedy to national reform. The moral of this story is clear. When humanity forgets to respect the land reminds humanity who holds real power. But we also learn something hopeful. People are stronger than disaster. They bend, but they do not break. The Dust Bowl generation survived because they believed tomorrow could be better than today. So as you leave this journey, carry 3 lessons with you. Keycap 1, protect nature, because it protects us. Keycap 2, never underestimate the strength inside ordinary people. Keycap 3, every defeat can become the beginning of a new dream. And remember, this long story you listened to today is only one of many hidden inside history's shadows. If you want more journeys like this, more untold stories, more mysteries from the past, and more forgotten human voices brought back to life, then come back to this channel, History Teller YT, where history is not just dates and facts. It is emotion, identity, and life. Subscribe, stay curious, and join us next time for another unforgettable chapter from the world's past. Until then, thank you for listening. Stay safe, and keep history alive. These abandoned spaces also carry emotional significance for descendants returning to explore family history. Some walk through ruined houses imagining grandparents who once cooked on those stoves or rocked babies beside those walls. These visits blend archaeology with mourning and pride. Ghost towns highlight the long-term realities of migration. While California gained workers, the plains lost future populations. Communities never replaced lost generations. This demographic shift shaped state politics, agriculture, and cultural identity for decades. Perhaps the most haunting element of Dust Bowl archaeology is silence. Unlike battlefields lined with memorial plaques, abandoned farms hold no formal record, only objects slowly decaying. Yet their existence teaches what textbooks cannot. Dust storms erased lives physically, economically, and spatially. This archaeology warns future generations that environmental abuse leaves visible scars. Without sustainable farming and careful planning, history can repeat itself, not through memory, but through landscape erosion and lost communities. Long after the Dust Bowl storms ended, migrants who had traveled west continued to struggle with identity and belonging. The journey to California did not simply reshape geography. It reshaped culture, emotion, and the meaning of citizenship in America. When tens of thousands of families left their plains homes behind, they entered a new world filled with disbelief, judgment, and hope. Over the next decades, Okie identity transformed from insult to emblem, becoming central to American working-class history. When migrants first arrived in California in the 1930s, they encountered intense discrimination. Locals feared wage competition, disease, and social instability. Newspapers warned Californians that Dust Bowl migrants were invaders. Some towns passed ordinances limiting settlement, while police patrolled county borders to block migrant vehicles. At school, migrant children sat apart, mocked for their accents and clothing. In workplaces, Okie laborers accepted lower pay because refusal meant starvation. Society forced them into a label they did not choose. Yet Okies refused to disappear beneath stigma. Within migrant camps, they built strong internal communities. They developed networks of support, shared information about job openings, taught one another farming skills, and created informal justice systems to manage conflict. Their identity evolved from isolation to solidarity. Even fellow migrants from Texas, Kansas, and Colorado embraced the Okie label eventually, understanding that it symbolized shared suffering and resistance. Music preserved this cultural transformation. Songs played on fiddles, guitars, and harmonicas told stories of lost homes, broken roads, and relentless faith. Woody Guthrie's lyrics not only documented the Dust Bowl, but constructed cultural pride from emotional defeat. Through song, Okies gained national recognition not as helpless victims, but as storytellers whose experiences shaped American folk identity. Over time, migrants learned to navigate California culture. They mastered job markets, built churches and schools, and purchased homes. Many found work in wartime industry during the 1940s, producing aircraft and munitions. Their children graduated from California high schools, entered universities, and worked in medicine, business, engineering, and education. The Okie label shifted meaning. What once symbolized humiliation became an origin story. Identity strengthened through intermarriage between migrant communities and existing West Coast culture. New accents emerged, blends of Southern drawl, Plains twang, and Pacific speech patterns. New foods and traditions formed. In some families, biscuits and gravy shared table space with citrus fruits and seafood, reflecting merged cultures. Despite progress, memory remained rooted in hardship. Descendants recalled grandparents who still saved plastic bags and bread crusts because wastefulness violated their Dust Bowl survival ethic. Many kept photographs of farms buried under dust, even though their children grew up miles from any prairie. Today, Okie identity symbolizes resilience. Museums in California celebrate migrant history through exhibitions, photographs, and personal artifacts. Schools teach Dust Bowl migration as part of state history, acknowledging the community's role in shaping California's agricultural economy. This cultural journey shows how migration reshaped belonging. The Dust Bowl forced Americans to redefine identity, not through birthplace, but through endurance, adaptation, and community. The Dust Bowl migration deeply influenced American labor history. It not only moved people across geography, it altered class structure, workforce dynamics, and political power. Before the 1930s, most Plains migrants believed their futures lay in farming. When drought destroyed that path, migrants entered an industrializing economy, shifting national labor identity. Agricultural work shaped early migrant experience. In California's San Joaquin and Imperial Valleys, thousands picked grapes, cotton, lettuce, and citrus fruit. These jobs paid little and offered seasonal instability. Yet the work introduced migrants to wage labor systems not rooted in land ownership. Many learned new disciplines: clock-based scheduling, wage negotiation, and union organizing. Dust Bowl migrants soon became central players in agricultural labor battles. Growers exploited workers by paying meager wages and threatening blacklisting to discourage complaints. But migrants learned to unionize, gaining political voice. When strikes erupted, such as the 1933 cotton strike, Okies participated alongside Filipino, Mexican, and Japanese workers. These alliances challenged racial divisions and expanded labor movement diversity. The Dust Bowl migration also altered class perception. Before the crisis, many Plains farmers identified as independent entrepreneurs, not working-class laborers. In California, wage labor forced them into new identities, aligned with factory workers and miners. They became part of the national struggle between labor and capital, a struggle central to 20th century American politics. Post-war industrial growth accelerated class mobility. Many migrant descendants joined unions, attended college on the GI Bill, and entered well-paid professions. The children of Dust Bowl refugees integrated into middle-class society, bridging the divide between rural farming life and urban advancement. The migration also influenced women's labor roles. Plains women who once focused on household duties entered fields and canneries, earning wages and personal independence. This experience widened opportunities for their daughters, who later entered teaching, medicine, and business. Racial diversity became another consequence. Dust Bowl migrants worked alongside Mexican immigrant families and African American sharecroppers, forging shared identity through labor rather than heritage. Over decades, these groups shaped multicultural California working-class culture. The Dust Bowl migration demonstrated that economic instability could transform national class structure, pushing closed communities into broader economic participation. Migration forced Americans to recognize that identity was fluid, that the son of an Oklahoma wheat farmer could become a Boeing aircraft builder, a San Francisco mechanic, or a Los Angeles teacher. This transformation reinforced a central theme of American life. When disaster removes one path, society must construct another. The Dust Bowl reshaped the United States by turning displaced farmers into industrial workers, union leaders, educators, soldiers, and business owners. Their contributions strengthened the nation long after storms ended. Perhaps the most lasting cultural legacy of the Dust Bowl migration lies in its reshaping of the American dream itself. Before the 1930s, the dream largely centered on land ownership, a house on a farm, crops that supported family, and independence from labor markets. But the storms revealed land ownership was not always secure. Nature could erase property, wealth, and identity. As migrants rebuilt lives in California, the meaning of the American dream expanded. For Dust Bowl migrants, success no longer relied on land alone. It depended on opportunity, education, mobility, and human dignity. Farmers who once measured life by harvest output began valuing their children's academic achievements or their own industrial wages. This shift altered national consciousness. California, with its booming wartime economy and growing cities, represented a new horizon. Owning a house on a city lot instead of hundreds of acres, attending college rather than inheriting farmland, finding job security in factories or service work rather than uncertain crops, building multicultural communities rather than isolated rural towns. The migration also revealed the American dream's fragility. Migrants learned that opportunity did not arrive automatically. Society enforced barriers. Prejudice limited access to schools, neighborhoods, and jobs. But facing those obstacles strengthened belief in fairness and civil rights. Dust Bowl families played roles in future social activism, encouraging fair labor laws, migrant worker protections, and anti-discrimination policies. The American dream also took on emotional meaning. Success was measured not by wealth, but by survival, dignity, and family unity. Oral histories from migrants express gratitude not for riches, but for simple joys: owning a clean bed, breathing dust-free air, or sending children to school with shoes. Decades later, the Dust Bowl became symbol of the American dream, transformed through adversity. The story taught that dreams must adapt to changing reality, and that perseverance builds meaning from hardship. Through migration, identity shifted from regional to national. It proved that Americans could reinvent themselves across states and generations. In that way, the Dust Bowl migration not only redefined identity, it reshaped the very concept of hope in the United States. Long after the last storm settled, the emotional wounds of the Dust Bowl continued shaping the inner lives of those who survived. The disaster did not simply damage soil. It altered human psychology, influencing how entire generations viewed stability, nature, fear, family bonds, and the fragility of life. Survivors rarely spoke openly about trauma in the early decades, because the culture of the mid-20th century encouraged silence rather than emotional vulnerability. Yet diaries, interviews, and oral histories reveal that psychological struggle became one of the most lasting consequences of the Dust Bowl. Many survivors described long-term anxiety linked to weather patterns. Something as simple as dry wind brushing across skin could trigger panic. Some survivors avoided leaving windows open for the rest of their lives, even after moving hundreds of miles from the plains. Others refused to buy light-colored furniture or bedding because they associated pale fabrics with the endless dusting of their childhood. Nightmares remain common. Adults and children who once lived through dust pneumonia or watched loved ones choke during storms often dreamed of darkness sweeping across rooms. In some families, parents woke in the night to check their children's breathing decades after the crisis ended. These habits illustrate how trauma rewires instinct. Depression also left a mark. Farmers who had built identity around self-sufficiency struggled to reconcile their past roles with years spent dependent on government aid or charity. Some never returned emotionally to the confidence they had before the 1930s. Their children recalled fathers who rarely smiled or mothers who avoided discussing the past because memories were too painful. Still, emotional healing occurred gradually. Many survivors believed that rebuilding farms, returning to work, raising families, and engaging in community helped them recover psychologically. Physical labor, once a source of suffering, became therapy. Planting gardens or painting barns gave symbolic closure. Renewal, replacing ruin. Storytelling also became healing. In the 1970s and 1980s, university researchers interviewed aging Dust Bowl survivors for oral history projects. For some, these sessions marked the first time they publicly described their trauma. Many cried during interviews, not from fresh pain, but from relief at finally speaking openly. Their voices preserved psychological truth for future generations. Children of Dust Bowl survivors often inherited emotional memory. Psychologists call this phenomenon intergenerational trauma. Fear and caution pass from parent to child, even without clear explanation. Descendants grew up in households that prioritized preparedness. Full pantries, emergency water supplies, frugality, and suspicion of debt. Some children became anxious about financial instability, even with stable incomes, because their parents' childhood memories shaped family rules. Yet the psychological legacy was not entirely negative. Survivors passed on resilience, gratitude, and humility. They taught that comfort should never be taken for granted, and that cooperation helps humans endure nature's worst events. Many descendants admire their ancestors' endurance and feel pride rather than pity. The Dust Bowl shaped inner life by teaching that loss is survivable, that community heals wounds, and that dignity can grow from hardship. Emotional recovery proved as transformative as agricultural recovery, because rebuilding soil matters, but rebuilding the human spirit matters even more. The Dust Bowl era reshaped gender dynamics and social roles in ways American culture rarely expected. Women and men both faced new challenges requiring new forms of leadership, cooperation, and sacrifice. The traditional boundaries that once separated men's and women's responsibilities blurred during the crisis, revealing that survival depends not on rigid tradition, but on shared effort and adaptability. Before the Dust Bowl, most Plains households followed well-defined gender roles. Men farmed, ran finances, and led community decisions. Women cooked, cleaned, managed children, and preserved food. But when storms destroyed land and migration altered lifestyle, these divisions no longer fit reality. Families needed all available hands to survive. Women took on new tasks outside traditional domestic boundaries. They repaired roofs, mended farming equipment, hauled water, traded goods, and organized neighborhood relief networks. They discovered mechanical skills once reserved for men, fixing vehicles, sharpening tools, and running small-scale farm operations while husbands searched for work. Migration intensified this shift. On the road to California, women managed navigation, ration planning, and emotional care. In crowded migrant camps, women became community diplomats, negotiating sleeping arrangements, sharing cooking duties, and settling disputes between families. Their leadership fostered unity rather than division. Men, meanwhile, learned to perform roles previously considered women's work. They cooked meals, bathed children, and cleaned campsites when wives fell ill or worked outside the home. Many fathers formed deeper emotional bonds with their children, spending more time teaching, storytelling, and comforting them during storms. The Dust Bowl also redefined women's public voices. Female journalists, photographers, and interview subjects shaped national awareness. Dorothea Lange captured the pain and dignity of motherhood in photographs like Migrant Mother, turning one woman's expression into a symbol of national crisis. Women authors wrote powerful accounts of their lives, challenging stereotypes about rural invisibility. In California, gender roles evolved again. Women worked in canneries, hospitals, and agricultural fields. Wartime industry later opened factory and shipping jobs. These opportunities expanded women's independence, influencing post-war feminist development. Their daughters grew up watching mothers earn wages and demand respect, helping fuel mid-century women's rights movements. Gender roles shifted emotionally as well. Husbands and wives who survived the Dust Bowl together often formed deeper partnerships, built more on equality than on hierarchy. Their shared trauma strengthened marital bonds. Stories describe couples who worked side by side from sunrise to sunset, developing mutual admiration rather than strict obedience-based roles. But not all social change was liberating. Stress increased domestic conflict. Some men, ashamed of poverty, expressed anger violently. Newspapers documented cases of alcoholism, abandonment, and abuse. Women found themselves protecting children alone or managing households without support. Community leaders and church groups tried to mitigate harm, but the trauma of environmental collapse sometimes fractured families. The Dust Bowl challenged assumptions about gender identity. It proved that social stability requires flexibility, not rigid roles enforced by tradition, but adaptable skills shaped by necessity. In the long term, women who lived through the Dust Bowl raised daughters to expect wider horizons and sons to respect partnership. The storm winds, though destructive, blew open social doors that had remained closed for generations. The Dust Bowl also redefined women's public voices. Female journalists, photographers, and interview subjects shaped national awareness. Dorothea Lange captured the pain and dignity of motherhood in photographs like Migrant Mother, turning one woman's expression into a symbol of national crisis. Women authors wrote powerful accounts of their lives, challenging stereotypes about rural invisibility. In California, gender roles evolved again. Women worked in canneries, hospitals, and agricultural fields. Wartime industry later opened factory and shipping jobs. These opportunities expanded women's independence, influencing post-war feminist development. Their daughters grew up watching mothers earn wages and demand respect, helping fuel mid-century women's rights movements. Gender roles shifted emotionally as well. Husbands and wives who survived the Dust Bowl together often formed deeper partnerships, built more on equality than on hierarchy. Their shared trauma strengthened marital bonds. Stories describe couples who worked side by side from sunrise to sunset, developing mutual admiration rather than strict obedience-based roles. But not all social change was liberating. Stress increased domestic conflict. Some men, ashamed of poverty, expressed anger violently. Newspapers documented cases of alcoholism, abandonment, and abuse. Women found themselves protecting children alone or managing households without support. Community leaders and church groups tried to mitigate harm, but the trauma of environmental collapse sometimes fractured families. The Dust Bowl challenged assumptions about gender identity. It proved that social stability requires flexibility, not rigid roles enforced by tradition, but adaptable skills shaped by necessity. In the long term, women who lived through the Dust Bowl raised daughters to expect wider horizons and sons to respect partnership. The storm winds, though destructive, blew open social doors that had remained closed for generations.